The Vorton Empire had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years, and their power was absolute and unchallenged across 1,000 star systems. Their military fleets numbered in the millions, and their weapons could shatter planets into dust with a single shot. Every species that had ever challenged them had been crushed and erased from existence within days. The Vorton believed themselves to be the ultimate power in the universe, and nothing could ever threaten their supremacy. They had destroyed over 300 civilizations and enslaved countless more. When their deep space sensors detected humanity expanding into the outer regions of the Orion Spur, the Imperial Council viewed it as they viewed all other species, an infestation that needed to be eliminated before it could spread. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the human warship Defiant when the alien transmission arrived without warning. The holographic image of High Executor Zalseth materialized in the center of the bridge, and its 6 glowing eyes stared at the humans with obvious contempt. The alien creature was tall and covered in dark purple scales that reflected the bridge lights. Its 4 arms moved in agitated patterns as the translator device rendered its harsh clicking language into cold mechanical English. The message was simple and brutal. Humanity had 10 days to surrender every ship and every colony or face total annihilation. There would be no negotiation and no mercy. The Vorton had spoken, and they expected complete obedience. Jake kept his face calm even though his heart was racing in his chest. Behind him stood Commander Lisa Hayes, and she gripped the edge of her control console so hard her knuckles turned white. The entire bridge crew had gone silent, and the only sound was the soft humming of the ship's systems. Jake measured his words carefully before responding. He explained that humanity claimed no territory belonging to the Vorton Empire, and they were simply exploring unclaimed star systems that belonged to no one. Zalseth's response was immediate and filled with rage. All systems belonged to the Vorton by right of superior power. Humanity had been warned, and now they would comply or be destroyed. The transmission ended abruptly, and the bridge erupted into nervous conversations. Jake turned to face his crew and saw the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else that gave him hope. He saw defiance and determination. These were people who had trained their entire lives to explore the unknown and protect humanity from threats. They would not surrender without a fight. Jake ordered an immediate priority communication channel to Earth Command and told someone to wake up every engineer on the ship. They were going to need every advantage they could find in the next 10 days. The message was sent at faster than light speed and would reach Earth within hours. On Earth, President Helen Carter was pulled from her bed in the middle of the night and rushed to the underground situation room. She arrived to find the room already filled with military officers and civilian advisors, all looking at the recorded Vorton transmission on the main screen. General Peter Hayes, the head of the Space Defense Force, briefed the president on what they knew. The Vorton fleet was estimated at over 2 million combat vessels, based on long-range sensor data. Humanity had roughly 8,000 ships that could be considered ready for combat. The numbers were so one-sided that several advisors suggested immediate surrender to save human lives. Helen Carter sat at the head of the table and listened to every opinion without interrupting. When everyone had spoken, she leaned forward and asked one simple question: what were humanity's actual options? Admiral Christine Moore, a veteran of the Mars Independence War, answered bluntly. They could surrender and hope for mercy from an empire that had never shown mercy to anyone, or they could fight and die on their own terms. There was a long silence after those words. Helen looked around the table at every face and saw the same thing in all of them: fear mixed with stubborn human pride. She made her decision. Helen told them that humanity had never been good at accepting ultimatums from bullies and tyrants. She ordered General Hayes to put every ship on full combat alert and told Admiral Moore to make sure every defense platform from Mercury to Pluto was operational and ready. She wanted every tactical expert and military strategist humanity had ever produced brought to Earth immediately. If they were going to fight an empire, then they would fight smart and use every advantage they possessed. The room erupted into activity as orders went out across the solar system. In the outer colonies, the news of the Vorton ultimatum spread through the communication networks within hours. On New Terra, a farming colony of 3 million people, Governor Danny Pierce called an emergency gathering in the Central Plaza. Families arrived in worried groups and children held tight to their parents' hands. The plaza could hold 10,000 people, and it was packed beyond capacity with more watching on screens throughout the colony. Danny stood on the platform and looked at his people. He would not lie to them about the danger they faced. He explained that humanity was facing something bigger and more dangerous than anything in their history. An empire that had crushed hundreds of civilizations was now coming for them. A woman in the front row named Amy Collins stood up with her two small children beside her. She was a teacher at the colony school and her voice shook when she spoke. She asked the question everyone wanted answered. What could they possibly do against such overwhelming power? Danny met her eyes and gave her the only honest answer he had. They would do what humans had always done throughout history. They would adapt to the situation and find creative solutions. They would refuse to give up no matter how bad things looked. Most importantly, they would trust in each other and stand together. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then slowly people began to nod. They were afraid, but they were not defeated. Back on the Defiant, Jake Morrison sat alone in his private quarters, staring at everything humanity had learned about the Vorton over the years. Their ships were massive constructions powered by zero-point energy reactors that could generate more power than a small sun. Their weapons used exotic matter and could crack a planet's crust with sustained fire. Their defensive shields had never been breached in 12,000 years of recorded history. Every piece of data Jake reviewed told him the same thing. This was a fight humanity could not win through conventional means. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and facing an enemy with technology centuries beyond their own. Lisa Hayes entered his quarters without bothering to knock, and she carried 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Jake and sat down across from him. She asked him to tell her they had some chance of surviving this. Jake looked at her and thought about all the years they had served together. 15 years of exploration missions and combat situations and everything in between. He told her they had something the Vorton did not have. They had a reason to fight that went beyond conquest and pride. The Vorton were fighting because humanity existed in space they claimed as their own. Humanity was fighting for the right to continue existing at all. That difference in motivation might be the only advantage they possessed. Lisa smiled slightly and asked if he really believed that motivation could overcome such terrible odds. Jake replied that he had to believe it because in 10 days the largest and most powerful military force in the galaxy was going to try to erase humanity from existence. Belief and determination might be the only things that kept them going when the fighting started. The 2 officers sat in silence drinking their coffee and watching the stars through the viewport. Somewhere out there, the Vorton fleet was already moving toward human space. The countdown had begun and there was no way to stop what was coming. The shipyards orbiting Mars became a place of constant activity that never stopped day or night. Chief Engineer Kyle Bennett had not slept properly in 5 days as he supervised the emergency retrofitting of every human warship. The massive orbital docks echoed with the sounds of welding torches and plasma cutters working around the clock. Thousands of workers moved between the ships installing new weapon systems and reinforcing hull plating. Kyle stood on the observation platform overlooking the main construction bay and watched dozens of ships being modified simultaneously. He opened a communication channel to Admiral Christine Moore, who was coordinating the overall defense efforts from Earth. Kyle reported that they were installing the new experimental weapon systems on all the heavy cruisers, but he needed to be honest about their situation. Even with all these upgrades and improvements, humanity was still throwing small rocks at a mountain. The technology gap was simply too large. Christine listened to his assessment and then asked about the experimental quantum slipstream drives that had been in development for years. Kyle hesitated before answering because the slipstream drives were extremely dangerous and barely functional. They had already lost 2 prototype ships during testing, when the drives tore the vessels apart from the inside. The stress on the hull structure was beyond anything human engineering had dealt with before. Christine asked if he could give her 20 ships with working slipstream capability in the next 9 days. Kyle ran his hand through his gray hair and calculated the possibilities in his head. He told her he could maybe give her 15 ships with the drives installed. Maybe. He also could not guarantee those ships would not tear themselves into pieces the first time they activated the drives. Christine considered this for a moment and then told him she would take those odds. She needed him to make it happen regardless of the risks. Kyle nodded and closed the channel. He turned to his engineering teams and told them they had a new priority mission that might be impossible, but they were going to do it anyway. On Earth, in the deep research facility buried beneath the Rocky Mountains, Dr. Laura Bennett was staring at data that seemed to have no solution. She was humanity's leading expert on exotic physics and theoretical energy systems. Right now, she was looking at simulations of Vorton shield technology that had been recreated from long-range sensor scans. For the 1,000th time, the computer simulation showed human weapons hitting the alien shields and accomplishing absolutely nothing. The energy barriers simply absorbed every attack. Laura told her research assistant Marcus Flynn to run the simulation one more time, even though she knew the result would be the same. Marcus sat at his console and entered the commands, but then he paused and looked up at Laura. He asked what if they were thinking about the problem in the wrong way. Humanity had been trying to overpower the Vorton shields with brute force, but what if they did not need to? Laura turned to face him and asked what he was suggesting. Marcus explained his theory. The Vorton shields were designed to stop high-energy impacts like kinetic rounds and plasma bursts and nuclear detonations. But what about something completely different? What about using resonance frequencies instead of raw power? Laura's eyes widened as she understood what he meant. They could try to vibrate the shields, apart using harmonic interference. Marcus clarified that they would not actually destroy the shields, but they could create enough harmonic disruption to open a small gap for a fraction of a second. Laura was already pulling up new calculations on her computer terminal. If they could synchronize multiple ships to hit the exact same point on a shield with precise frequency modulation, they might be able to create a momentary opening. She and Marcus worked through the entire night running simulations and testing theories. By morning, they had developed something that looked like it might actually work under perfect conditions. Laura immediately sent her findings directly to Admiral Morrison on the Defiant with a priority flag. Jake read the scientific report 3 times to make sure he understood what Dr. Bennett was proposing. He called his senior staff to the conference room for an emergency meeting. Around the table sat Lisa Hayes, Tactical Officer Commander Greg Palmer, and Chief Science Officer Lieutenant Carla Martinez. Jake explained that Dr. Bennett believed she had found a way to penetrate Vorton shields, but it required microsecond timing coordination across multiple ships firing simultaneously. Greg whistled low and shook his head. He pointed out that kind of precision was nearly impossible in actual combat conditions. The communication lag alone between ships would throw off any synchronization they tried to achieve. Carla suggested a different approach. What if they did not use normal communications at all? What if they used quantum entanglement to link the targeting computers directly together? There would be no lag time and the synchronization would be perfect. Lisa leaned forward and reminded everyone that quantum computing on that scale was still theoretical technology. Humanity had never successfully implemented it in any practical application. Jake looked at each of them and said they had never fought a war against an empire of 2 million ships either. The old rules did not apply anymore. He told Carla to coordinate directly with Dr. Bennett, and he wanted a working prototype system in 1 week. Across human space, every colony began preparations for war. On the agricultural world of New Haven, Governor Steve Walsh organized the civilian population into support units. He was a former military officer who had retired to farming, but now he found himself preparing his people for possible invasion. He gathered the colonists and explained that they could not fight Vorton warships directly, but they could make sure the human military had everything needed. Food supplies, medical support, logistics coordination. Every single person had a role to play in the coming conflict. Among the civilian volunteers was a nurse named Beth Warren, who had moved to New Haven to escape the crowded cities of Earth. She found herself training ordinary people in emergency medical procedures. She taught school teachers and farmers how to treat plasma burns and radiation exposure and traumatic injuries. A young farmer named Tim Rogers asked her if she really thought they would need all this medical training. Beth looked at him honestly and said she hoped not. But hope was not a strategy or a plan. Preparation was the only thing they could control. Tim nodded and went back to practicing the bandaging techniques she had shown him. President Helen Carter stood before the global parliament in a special emergency session. Representatives from every nation on Earth filled the chamber, and millions more watched the broadcast across the solar system. Helen spoke about humanity's history of facing extinction-level threats. Ice ages and plagues and world wars had all threatened to destroy civilization. Each time, people had been told they would not survive. Each time, humanity had proved the doubters wrong, not because humans were physically stronger than the forces against them, but because they refused to accept defeat as inevitable. She paused and looked across the assembly. The Vortan Empire saw humanity as insects and primitives. They would learn what every tyrant in history had learned. Underestimating humanity was always the first step toward their own defeat. The Parliament erupted in applause, but Helen knew the truth, that words alone meant nothing. Victory required action and sacrifice, and probably more blood than anyone wanted to think about. In orbit around Jupiter, Jake Morrison gathered the commanders of the entire human fleet through holographic communication. 200 ship captains appeared as translucent images around the conference room. Jake recognized many faces of officers he had served with over the years. He told them plainly that they had 6 days until the Vortan arrived. He would not lie about their situation. They were outnumbered and outgunned and facing an enemy that had never known defeat in 12,000 years. But humanity had advantages the enemy did not expect. Ingenuity and adaptability, and most importantly, each other. Captain Diana Foster commanded the heavy cruiser Valiant, and she asked what the actual battle plan was. Jake brought up a tactical display showing the approach vectors the Vortan would likely use. He explained that humanity was going to do something the enemy would never anticipate. They were going to attack first instead of defending. The announcement caused surprised murmurs among the assembled commanders. Jake continued explaining that the Vortan expected humans to defend their colonies and spread forces thin trying to protect everything. Instead, the human fleet would strike before the enemy reached human territory. They would show the Vortan that humanity did not wait to be slaughtered. Captain Ryan Cooper, who commanded the destroyer, Hawk grinned and said that was a plan he could support enthusiastically. Captain Natalie Brooks, who led the science vessel Discovery, warned that the strategy was extremely risky. If the attack failed, then Earth would be left undefended and vulnerable. Jake acknowledged the risk but explained that if they waited for the Vortan to reach Earth, they had already lost. Their only chance was to hurt the enemy badly enough and fast enough that the Vortan would reconsider whether humanity was worth the cost of destroying. As the meeting ended, Lisa Hayes remained behind with Jake. She asked quietly if he really believed they could win. Jake looked out at the stars, and the Vortan War fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system, and the sight would have broken the spirit of most civilizations in the galaxy. Over 300,000 warships appeared in perfect military formation, stretching across millions of kilometers of empty space. The vessels ranged from corvettes the size of skyscrapers to massive dreadnoughts that were larger than Earth's moon. At the center of this terrifying armada sat the Imperial flagship Eternal Dominion, a vessel 20 kilometers long that represented the absolute peak of Vortan engineering and military power. The ship bristled with weapons, and its shields could withstand the explosive force of a supernova. High Executor Zalseth stood on the command bridge of the Eternal Dominion and watched the tactical displays with satisfaction. The primitive human colony on the planet below would be the first to fall as a demonstration of what awaited all who defied the Empire. Zalseth ordered the deployment of advanced scout ships to map the human defenses before the main bombardment began. The scouts accelerated toward the inner system, expecting to find desperate defensive positions and frightened colonists. Instead, they found something completely unexpected. The colony had been evacuated and was completely empty. Waiting in orbit were exactly 12 human warships that looked tiny compared to the Vortan fleet. Admiral Jake Morrison commanded those 12 ships from the bridge of the Defiant. He opened a communication channel to all vessels under his command. He reminded them to remember their training and stay in tight formation and trust their wingmen completely. Today, humanity would show the galaxy what they were truly made of. His words were calm, but every person listening could hear the determination underneath. Commander Lisa Hayes monitored the approaching Vortan forces on her sensors. She reported that the enemy was launching fighter craft, and over 10,000 small attack ships were accelerating toward the human position. Jake told her to let them come. He ordered Greg Palmer to activate the resonance network that linked all 12 ships together. He told Carla Martinez to power up the experimental quantum targeting system that would synchronize their weapons. The pieces of humanity's desperate plan fell into place. Each ship was equipped with Dr. Bennett's experimental resonance generator. When activated in perfect synchronization through quantum entanglement, the system could theoretically create a harmonic frequency that would disrupt Vortan shields just long enough for weapons to penetrate. The word theoretically meant it had never been tested in actual combat conditions. The Vortan fighters screamed toward the human defensive line with their energy weapons blazing. The human ships opened fire with newly installed plasma cannons, and space became filled with explosions and weapon impacts. Despite being outnumbered nearly 1,000 to 1, the human vessels maintained their formation. Their movements were coordinated with inhuman precision, thanks to the quantum-entangled targeting computers linking them together. Carla reported that all resonance generators were online and synchronized. Jake gave the order to fire. What happened next would be studied by military historians for generations to come. All 12 human ships fired simultaneously, with their weapons calibrated to exactly the same harmonic frequency. The combined energy beam struck a single Vortan destroyer, and for exactly 1.3 seconds the enemy shields flickered and weakened. A tiny window was enough. The plasma rounds punched through the failing shields, and the Vortan destroyer exploded in a brilliant flash of light that lit up the darkness of space. On the Eternal Dominion, High Executor Zalseth stared at the tactical display in complete disbelief. A human weapon had penetrated Vortan shields, which was supposed to be impossible. His 6 eyes glowed brighter with rage as he snarled orders to his fleet. All ships were to concentrate fire on the human vessels and destroy them immediately. Jake had no intention of staying in one place to be targeted. He ordered all ships to execute the scatter protocol. Kyle Bennett protested from the engineering deck that the slipstream drives were still unstable and dangerous. Jake replied that stable had not been an option 9 days ago, and it was not an option now. He ordered the drives engaged immediately. The 12 human ships vanished from normal space and entered quantum slipstream. The Vortan sensors could not track this form of faster-than-light travel. The human ships reappeared thousands of kilometers away from their original position and fired again with perfect synchronization. Another Vortan ship died in a ball of fire. The pattern repeated over and over. Jump to a new position, synchronize the resonance weapons, fire at a single target, then jump away before the enemy could respond effectively. The human ships moved like ghosts across the battlefield, impossible to pin down or predict. They struck and vanished and struck again from a completely different angle. It was a tactic born from desperation and innovation, and against all odds it was working. On New Terra, Governor Danny Pierce watched the battle feed with the entire colony gathered around viewing screens. When the third Vortan ship exploded, the crowd erupted in cheers and tears. Amy Collins whispered that the fleet was actually hurting them and actually winning. Danny knew the harsh truth that 3 victories were impressive, but they were just the opening moves. The human fleet faced 300,000 enemy ships. Back in the Kepler system, the Vortan fleet began to adapt to the human tactics. Zalseth was a veteran of countless wars across thousands of years. He quickly recognized the pattern in the human strategy. He ordered the deployment of resonance dampeners to counter the harmonic weapons. He also commanded the fleet to spread into a sphere formation. When the humans appeared anywhere in the combat zone, they would be caught in crossfire from all directions simultaneously. The Vortan trap was closing, and Jake saw it developing on his tactical displays. Lisa noted grimly that the enemy was adapting faster than expected. If the human ships jumped into the middle of that sphere formation, they would not jump out again. Jake studied the tactical readouts, and his mind raced through possibilities and alternatives. They had proven humans could hurt the Vortan, but now they needed to survive long enough to make that victory meaningful. He suddenly ordered a communication channel open to the entire human fleet, not just his strike group of 12 ships. When the channel was active, Jake spoke with a calmness that hid his racing heart. He identified himself and reported that his strike group had engaged the enemy and confirmed that Vortan shields could be breached using resonance technology. They had destroyed 3 enemy vessels with 0 casualties on the human side. He transmitted all tactical data to every ship in human space. Humanity had shown that the enemy could bleed. Now they needed to show the Vortan they could lose completely. Across human-controlled space, ship captains and crews received the transmission. On the heavy cruiser Valiant, Captain Diana Foster smiled grimly. She ordered her helm officer to set course for the Kepler system at maximum possible speed. It was time to join the fight. From Earth and Mars and every human colony and outpost, the fleet began moving toward a single destination. Nearly 8,000 ships representing humanity's entire military strength converged on the Kepler system. Admiral Christine Moore commanded the Earth Defense Fleet from her flagship. She opened a secure channel to President Helen Carter. Christine reported that she was taking the entire fleet to support Admiral Morrison's strike force. Earth would be defended only by the orbital weapons platforms and the small reserve squadrons. Helen Carter sat in the White House Situation Room, feeling the weight of the decision. She was gambling everything on a single battle. She told Christine to bring their people home safe. Christine replied that she absolutely intended to do exactly that. In the Kepler system, Jake's strike group was running out of options. The Vorton had them surrounded, and the quantum slipstream drives were showing dangerous stress fractures in the ship systems. Kyle reported from engineering that they could not keep using the drives. They were going to fail catastrophically. Jake made a decision. They would make one final jump directly into the heart of the enemy formation. They would use synchronized resonance on the Vorton flagship. If they were going to die, then they would take that massive ship with them. Lisa turned to face him and said quietly that the plan was suicide. Jake replied that everything they had done for the past 10 days had been suicide. At least this way their deaths would matter. Before they could execute the desperate maneuver, space began to ripple with incoming hyperspace signatures. Then it rippled again and again. The human fleet had arrived in force. 8,000 ships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, and they surrounded the Vorton armada. For the first time in 12,000 years of military dominance, a Vorton war fleet found itself facing an enemy that was not running away in terror. Admiral Christine Moore's voice came across the command frequency. She congratulated Morrison on the excellent warm-up and said now they would finish this properly. Jake Morrison, exhausted and battered but very much alive, smiled. He replied gladly and ordered all ships to engage at will. He told the fleet to show the Vorton what humanity could accomplish when they fought together. The Battle of Kepler had begun in earnest, and the galaxy would never be the same. The space around the Kepler system had become a storm of energy weapons and explosions and dying ships. 8,000 human vessels faced 300,000 Vorton warships in a battle that defied every military calculation and strategic analysis. By every reasonable prediction, humanity should have been annihilated in the first 10 minutes of fighting. But humanity had never been particularly good at following predictions or accepting impossible odds. Admiral Christine Moore commanded the engagement from her flagship Liberty, which was humanity's largest and most powerful warship. Around her, the bridge crew worked with disciplined efficiency to coordinate thousands of vessels across millions of cubic kilometers of combat space. Christine ordered all fleet groups to implement Dr. Bennett's resonance protocol immediately. She wanted target clusters of 5 ships working together. Each group would synchronize their weapons, fire at a single enemy vessel, then move to a new position before the Vorton could respond. The human fleet broke apart into coordinated squadrons with each group of ships linking their quantum-entangled targeting computers together. Where Jake Morrison's original 12 ships had been a surgical knife, Christine's full fleet was an entire operating room. Dozens of Vorton vessels began exploding simultaneously as concentrated resonance fire found weak points in their supposedly impenetrable shields. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, High Executor Zalseth watched casualty reports mounting with growing fury. 30 ships lost, then 50, then 100. The numbers were insignificant compared to the overall fleet size, but the very fact that primitive humans were inflicting any casualties was an insult to 12,000 years of Vorton supremacy. No species had ever successfully fought back against the Empire. Zalseth's rage overcame his tactical judgment. He ordered the activation of the planet cracker weapons. If the Vorton could not have this star system, then neither would humanity. The massive artillery platforms began powering up their devastating weapons. Their target was New Terra, the closest human colony world that held 3 million civilian lives. On New Terra, Governor Danny Pierce received the emergency warning from Fleet Intelligence. He had approximately 20 minutes before the planet crackers fired their weapons. He immediately ordered emergency evacuation protocols. Everyone needed to get to the underground shelters immediately. Amy Collins was teaching her class when the alarms began sounding throughout the colony. She had 35 students ranging from 6 to 10 years old. She kept her voice steady and calm as she guided them toward the nearest shelter entrance. She told them everything would be okay and they had practiced for this situation. But her hands shook because she knew the truth that the shelters were designed for meteor strikes and solar flares. not weapons designed to crack a planet's crust open. In space above, Jake Morrison saw the planet crackers powering up on his tactical display. The massive weapons were positioned in the center of the Vorton formation, protected by multiple layers of warships and defensive screens. He opened an urgent channel to Christine Moore. They could not allow those weapons to fire. Christine replied that she saw them, but they could not punch through that much defensive screening in the time they had available. Jake looked at his displays while his tactical computer ran probability calculations. Every single scenario showed failure. The planet crackers would fire, New Terra would die, and humanity would lose 3 million people in an instant, unless they tried something desperate. Jake asked Lisa how many ships still had functional slipstream drives. She checked her readouts and reported 15 ships, including the Defiant, but the drives were at critical stress levels and one more jump would probably tear them apart. Jake said then they would make that one jump count. He opened a channel to all the slipstream-equipped vessels. He explained they were going to jump directly beside the planet crackers and destroy them before they could fire. He would not lie to them about the situation. This was a one-way trip. The drives would not survive another jump. They would have no escape route. But 3 million people were counting on them to succeed. There was a moment of silence on the communication channel. Then one by one the ship captains responded with acknowledgement. Captain Diana Foster said the Valiant was with him. Captain Ryan Cooper confirmed the Hawk was ready. All 15 ships acknowledged the order. 15 crews volunteering for what was almost certainly a suicide mission. Carla Martinez reported from the science station that slipstream coordinates were locked. The generators were at maximum power. She calculated a 93% probability of catastrophic drive failure. Jake replied that there was a 100% probability of 3 million deaths if they did not try. He counted down from 3 and ordered all ships to engage simultaneously. 15 human ships vanished from normal space and reappeared in the heart of the Vorton formation. They materialized directly beside the planet cracker platforms. The massive weapons were less than a kilometer away, and Jake could see the energy building in their firing chambers with his own eyes. He shouted for all weapons to fire immediately. The 15 ships unleashed everything in their arsenals: plasma cannons and missile pods and railguns and experimental weapons that had barely passed safety testing. The concentrated barrage hammered into the planet crackers at point blank range with devastating effect. The Vorton. Defensive ships scrambled to respond, but they were positioned to stop attacks from outside the formation, not from ships that appeared in their midst. The planet crackers had been designed for orbital bombardment, not for defending themselves. They could not withstand the sudden assault. One by one, the massive weapons exploded as their stored energy detonated. The blast vaporized nearby Vorton vessels in expanding spheres of destruction, but Jake had been correct about the slipstream drives. On the Defiant, alarms screamed as the quantum generator began tearing itself apart. Kyle Bennett reported from engineering that they had hull breaches on multiple decks, and containment was failing rapidly. Jake ordered immediate ship evacuation. All hands to the escape pods. He told everyone to move quickly. The crew of the Defiant raced for survival as their ship died around them. Jake remained on the bridge until the last crew member had evacuated. Then he turned to Lisa and told her it was time to leave. They ran together through corridors filled with smoke and electrical sparks. The ship groaned and shuddered around them as systems failed. Behind them, the quantum drive finally gave up and the resulting explosion began tearing the ship apart from the inside. They reached an escape pod with only seconds to spare. Jake slammed the launch button and the pod ejected just as the aft section of the Defiant disintegrated. Through the viewport, Jake watched his ship for the past 8 years break apart in a cascade of explosions. Around him, other escape pods were launching from the other 14 dying ships, crews escaping as their vessels sacrificed themselves. Beyond the escape pods, he could see the planet crackers, all of them destroyed and no longer a threat to New Terra. Admiral Moore's voice came through the emergency channel. She told them that recovery teams were already en route to collect all escape pods. She called them beautiful and crazy heroes who had just saved 3 million lives. On New Terra, Amy Collins emerged from the shelter with her students to find the sky still intact and the planet still whole. She fell to her knees and wept with relief. Governor Danny Pierce addressed his people through every communication channel available. The planet crackers had been destroyed and they were safe. They owed their lives to 15 ship crews who gave everything to protect strangers they would never meet. Back in the battle zone, The destruction of the planet crackers created a psychological effect that no one had anticipated. For 12,000 years, the Vortan had relied on overwhelming force and terror weapons. They had never faced an enemy willing to sacrifice themselves to protect others. The concept was completely alien to their understanding of warfare. Species were supposed to surrender when faced with superior power, not throw away their lives for abstract concepts like duty and honor. High Executor Zalseth stared at the tactical display and watched humans recovering their escape pods even while the battle continued around them. The primitives had lost 15 warships, but they were celebrating because they had saved their colony. For the first time in his long military career spanning thousands of years, Zalseth felt something he had never experienced before: doubt. He ordered the forward elements to press the attack, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty and absolute confidence. The battle raged on for hours, but something fundamental had changed in the nature of the conflict. The Vortan had learned that humans would not surrender and would not flee, and would sacrifice everything to protect their own people. The question that remained unanswered was whether courage and determination would be enough to win a war against an empire that had crushed 300 civilizations. The galaxy watched and waited to see if humanity's desperate gamble would succeed, or if they would become just another extinct species that had dared to challenge Vortan supremacy. The battle continued and ships died on both sides. But now the Vortan warriors felt something they had never felt before in 12,000 years of conquest. The Battle of Kepler had been raging for 6 hours, and the impossible was happening before the eyes of the watching galaxy. The human fleet, despite losing hundreds of ships and thousands of crew members, was holding its ground against the largest military force ever assembled. More than that, humanity was winning. Admiral Christine Moore watched the tactical displays on the bridge of the Liberty with grim satisfaction. The Vortan fleet had started with over 300,000 vessels, but now their numbers had fallen to 220,000. Human losses stood at nearly 2,000 ships. The casualty ratio was far better than anyone had dared to hope for when the battle began. Commander Oliver Grant, her tactical officer, reported that the Vortan fleet was starting to break formation. The outer wings of their massive armada were pulling back and showing signs of disorganization. Christine saw it too on her displays. The Vortan, who had never known defeat in 12,000 years of conquest, were experiencing something completely new and terrifying to them. They were feeling fear. She ordered all fleet groups to maintain pressure on the enemy. They could not give the Vortan time to reorganize their forces or develop new tactics. Humanity needed to push now and push hard and not stop until the enemy retreated from human space completely. On the recovered escape pods being brought aboard rescue shuttles, Jake Morrison and Lisa Hayes watched the ongoing battle through small viewports. They were heading back toward the Liberty, but Jake could not take his eyes off the fighting. Lisa said softly that they had actually done it and held against impossible odds. Jake replied that the battle was not finished yet, but yes, they had proven the Vortan could be beaten. At Earth, President Helen Carter stood in the Situation Room surrounded by advisors and military officers. Live feeds from the Kepler system played on every screen. When word came that the Vortan were beginning to show signs of retreat, the room erupted in cautious celebration. Helen ordered all remaining reserve forces to head for Kepler immediately. She wanted overwhelming presence there. If the enemy was going to run, then humanity would give them every reason to keep running. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, High Executor Zalseth was not retreating. Not yet. He had one final weapon to deploy, one last card to play that would turn this humiliating battle into a Vortan victory. He ordered the activation of the Imperial flagship's primary weapon system. The target would be the human command ship. His officers hesitated before carrying out the order. The primary weapon was essentially a miniaturized supernova contained in a magnetic bottle. It had only been used 3 times in all of Vortan history. The weapon required tremendous amounts of energy to charge and left the flagship completely vulnerable during the power-up sequence. Zalseth roared at his officers to execute his orders immediately. The weapon began its charging sequence and energy levels climbed toward catastrophic levels. On the Liberty, alarms screamed across every station as sensors detected the massive power spike building in the Vortan flagship. Oliver reported that the enemy ship was charging some kind of weapon. The energy signature was beyond anything in the database. Christine felt ice water in her veins. Whatever that weapon was, It had been designed specifically to destroy flagships and command vessels. She ordered the helm to execute emergency evasive maneuvers. She told all hands to brace for impact and prepare for the worst. As the Liberty began its turn, a new voice came over the command channel. Dr. Laura Bennett spoke from Earth Central Research. She had been monitoring the Vorton flagship's energy signature remotely. She believed she could stop that weapon from firing, but she needed a ship to get her close enough to the enemy flagship to transmit a resonance pulse directly into their power core. Christine replied that getting within 100 meters of a vessel 20 kilometers long while it was charging a superweapon was suicide. Laura said yes, she was fully aware of that fact, but it was the only way to save the Liberty and the entire fleet. She was already aboard a fast transport heading toward the battle zone. She just needed a volunteer pilot. In the shuttle carrying Jake Morrison back to the fleet, the call for a volunteer went out over the communication networks. Jake did not hesitate for even a second. He identified himself and said he would fly the transport. Lisa grabbed his arm and protested that he had just survived one suicide mission. Jake smiled at her and said that clearly meant he was good at surviving them. He told her she needed to take care of the fleet and make sure they finished what they started. Before she could argue further, Jake had already convinced the shuttle pilot to change course and intercept Dr. Bennett's transport. 10 minutes later, he sat at the controls of a small fast ship with Laura in the co-pilot seat, surrounded by her experimental equipment. Jake asked if she really knew what she was doing. Laura replied that she had run the calculations 800 times on the most powerful computers humanity possessed. In theory, if they could transmit a harmonic pulse at the exact moment the Vorton weapon reached peak charge, the resonance would cause a cascade failure in their power systems. The weapon would implode instead of firing outward. Jake asked about the part she was not saying. Laura said that in theory they would also die instantly in the resulting explosion, but at least the fleet would survive and continue fighting. Jake could not help but laugh at her dark humor. She said she preferred to think of it as realistic optimism. They raced toward the Vorton flagship, weaving through debris fields and weapon fire from both sides. The Eternal Dominion loomed ahead like a metal mountain floating in space. The superweapon was almost fully charged and glowing with barely contained energy at the ship's bow. Laura announced they had 30 seconds until firing. She was working to get the resonance transmitter into proper position. Jake pushed the transport's engines far beyond their safe limits. His decades of piloting experience kept them alive through reflexes and instinct as Vorton point defense systems opened fire. Explosions rocked the small transport and warning lights flashed across every console. Laura said 20 seconds and she was aligning the resonance transmitter. More explosions surrounded them and the transport shuddered from near misses. 10 seconds remaining. Jake told her it had been an honor to work with her. Laura replied that the honor was hers and told him to fire when ready. She activated the transmitter, and a focused beam of precisely calibrated harmonic energy shot across the gap between the transport and the flagship. The beam struck the Vorton power core at the exact microsecond it reached peak charge. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the power core began to vibrate. The vibration became oscillation. The oscillation became catastrophic resonance cascade that spread throughout the entire ship. Jake shouted for Laura to brace for impact as he threw the transport into the fastest turn of his entire life. The Vorton flagship's power core imploded, and the massive vessel tore itself apart from the inside out. The explosion was visible from New Terra, as a new star briefly blazing in the heavens. Jake and Laura's transport was caught in the edge of the blast wave and sent tumbling through space. Systems failed and the hull breached, but miraculously the ship remained in one piece. Laura gasped that she could not believe they were still alive. Jake replied while fighting with dead controls that they should not celebrate yet. They were drifting and venting atmosphere. Someone was going to need to rescue them soon. On the Liberty, Christine Moore watched the Vorton flagship die in a spectacular explosion and felt a surge of triumph wash over her. She ordered all ships to target the Vorton command structure immediately. The enemy had just lost their flagship and their high executor. She wanted humanity to hit them while they were in complete disarray. The human fleet pressed forward with renewed energy and determination. Without their flagship, and without their supreme commander, the Vorton formation collapsed like a house of cards. Ships began to scatter in every direction. Individual vessels jumped to hyperspace in panic without coordination or orders. Within 1 hour, the Battle of Kepler was over. The remaining Vortan vessels had retreated, leaving behind nearly 100,000 wrecked ships and the shattered remains of their mighty flagship. Humanity had lost over 3,000 ships and tens of thousands of brave crew members who would never see home again. But despite the terrible cost, they had won a victory that changed the galaxy forever. Rescue operations began immediately to recover survivors from damaged ships and escape pods. Admiral Morrison and Dr. Bennett were found drifting in their crippled transport and brought aboard a recovery vessel. The news of humanity's victory spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. The Vortan Empire, undefeated for 12,000 years, had been beaten by a species they had dismissed as primitive insects barely worth noticing. On Earth, President Helen Carter addressed not just humanity, but the entire galaxy through captured Vortan communication networks. She spoke to all civilizations that had suffered under Vortan tyranny and brought them a message of hope. The Empire could be defeated, and humanity had proven it beyond any doubt. Earth stood ready to assist any world that wished to throw off the chains of imperial conquest. She declared that the age of the Vortan was ending, and a new age of freed